IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anu, and with me is my colleague Sudisha, and you know us from the 20 Million Jobs Project at Takshashila. Hi Sudisha, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Anu, thanks for inviting me.
Great. So Sudisha, you and I both live in Delhi, and I think something that's top of mind for both of us right now is the obvious heat. It actually got me thinking. I've seen these updates on Swiggy, all the platforms that I actually use to order groceries and food from the comfort of my own home, is that they have these notifications talking about give your delivery partner a drink of water, be mindful. And it just got me a little thinking about the impact that global warming and heat in general has on the productivity of especially blue-collar workers and people who are employed in outdoor work. I know we've spoken on this podcast about work that organizations have done in terms of predicting the job loss that can happen from heat and the rise in temperature as well. So I thought that'd be a good topic for us to talk about, because one thing I think we can all agree on is it's really, really hot, and it gives me great pause to think about how people are still being productive in this environment today. I know you've been researching a little bit about this, so why don't you put some numbers and help illustrate this problem for us and really contextualize it for us outside of my long diatribe about how hot it is.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think before we start talking about job losses and its connection with the heat stress that we're all facing, first it's important to understand, is there really a temperature problem in India, right? We feel the heat, but I was just thinking about this, that I have been enduring the summer since I was a kid. And is it right for me to think that the heat has increased over the years? Because I don't really remember how hot it was when I was a kid, right? When you're a kid, you can't really have that information. You can't really understand information in that way. So
and the brain tends to remember our childhood with great fondness. So that's also
exactly
there.
So, and an anecdote is that, when you watch a show as a kid, you don't really focus on the minor details, but the same show, when you grow up, you see it from a completely different perspective. And the same analogy is also there with the temperature problem in India. Yes, we keep saying that it's getting hot, but is it really getting hot? And only numbers can prove that, and not anecdotes. So I started to look at a few numbers that can quantify whether or not we really do have a temperature problem in India. So here are some interesting studies that I've found. It's important to note that the rise in heat level has been really rapid in the past few decades, which, by the way, is not enough time to understand if there is really a heat or temperature problem in India, right? Because maybe 2-3 decades ago, nobody was sitting and wondering that, this is the kind of data that we need to keep. So, for example, population is something that countries always measure, even though census can get delayed. But this is the kind of data that we always have. So we can compare today's data with, let's say, 50, 60 years ago. But with respect to temperature, that's not the case. With respect to heat waves, for example, that's not the case, because we weren't really measuring that a few years back. But thankfully, there is some data, and that does help us paint a picture in order to understand if there truly is a temperature problem in India. So, for example, there's this independent study done by the India Meteorological Department, very recent, which showed that the number of heatwave days in India is increasing at a rapid pace every 10 years. So, between 1981 to 1990, we had 413 heat wave days in India. That number increased to 575 between 2001 to 2010. And that number further increased to 600 between 2011 to 2020. And this is a study that's been done independently, and since it's done by IMD, I find this information the most reliable, and it clearly shows that the number of heat wave days in India are going up. Additionally, there is data which has been revealed by the Ministry of Earth Sciences in India. This particular data really shocked me because this was released on 27 July last year. So July is what? Almost halfway into the year. By that point, if you count heat wave days in each state, we already had 203 heat wave days last year by the July mark. But it's important to note that there were a few overlaps. So, for example, one heat wave day in Uttarakhand is being counted as one day, and that is probably the same heat wave day in Haryana, but we are counting those as two different heat wave days. So this data is a little convoluted that way. But I found it really interesting that not all states have heat waves. So we can't really divide 203 heat wave days by 28 states and 8 union territories. There are only a few states which experience heat wave. So per each state, this number will go up, right? And then I looked at some more studies. So there was a study by IIT Mumbai which showed that India's northern parts may observe an increase of 4.5 degrees Celsius in overall daytime temperatures during summer by the end of the 21st century. And interestingly, even in the winters, the overall nighttime temperatures are expected to witness a 5-degree rise. So now it's important to understand what happens when there is a 1 degree rise in temperature, right? Because 4-5 degrees doesn't sound much. But when we talk about 4.5 degree rise by the end of the century in India, we are talking about that rise in average temperatures. And that's a lot, right? So it's important to understand what happens when there's a 1 degree rise in temperature. So there are studies that show that if the climate warms by 1 degree Celsius, the atmosphere would be able to hold about 7% more water vapor, which means that there will be more evaporation of our freshwater resources. And this in turn means that we are going to see a lot more droughts, a lot of our rivers, lakes drying up, which act as our freshwater resources. Evaporation will happen at a rapid speed. Now, what happens when this temperature goes up 2 degrees? And let's imagine this on a global scale, right? So when the temperature goes up 2 degrees on a global scale, you can imagine flooding in a lot of the world's major cities. There will be a global sea level rise of 56 centimeter. It is also estimated that the global GDP will be cut by 13%. 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity, and each year, hundreds will be killed across the world due to heat stress. And interestingly, in India, there would be 32 times as many extreme heat waves, each lasting 5 times as long and exposing 93 times more people. And the World Meteorological Department says that this is actually our best case scenario. So we can't even talk about what's the worst cases because they haven't really predicted it, or if they have predicted, they haven't really highlighted that.
That's some really sombering data. I think my eyebrows literally went up all the way up into my hairline at that point. And it can be really scary to hear all of this data, but let's also contextualize it a little bit in terms of what it means in reality for actual human beings. Sometimes data can feel a little disassociated to our reality. I know I spoke about the work that international organizations have done in predicting the impact that this would have, particularly on jobs. I remember the World Bank had, I believe, done a report where they spoke about how India could become one of the first places in the world to experience heat waves that break the human survivability limit. And they are predicting that of the 8 crore jobs that will be lost overall due to heat waves, 3.4 crores will come from India by 2030. And a rise in temperature and humidity both would up to, I think, 4.5% of India's GDP at risk by the end of this decade. So not only is there a human impact in terms of the crisis and dealing with the physical impact of the crisis, there's also a long-term impact, it seems like, in terms of how we make our living, how do we survive as human beings, and how we make sure that we're able to put food on the plate. And I think you also spoke about floods, which I know is already one of the largest causes of calamity in India, I believe, if I'm not wrong. And we know that that's also going to get worse. So let's contextualize this a little bit in terms of jobs, Sudisha. Is what does this mean for job losses, and why is talking about job losses in this context really important? Because honestly, it can feel like if there are all these natural calamities happening, we should probably be talking about relief efforts, how do we survive, and things like that. Why should we be talking about job losses when it comes to this category?
Yeah, so before I answer that qualitatively, let's start with an anecdote, right? Suppose it's 44 degrees in Delhi NCR, which it often is during this season. How do you go outside and work? Right? I'm seeing construction workers here, delivery people here, and I mean, people in similar jobs, vegetable vendors, for example, right? They have to work at the same spot in scorching heat, or vendors, for example, have to traverse the entire colony that they are generally selling in on foot. And just imagine how difficult it is for them, right? Can you imagine spending maybe 12, 14 hours a day in the kind of heat that we are experiencing in this city? It's not possible for us, right? And safe to say that people like us, we take an auto, we go via metro, we take a cab in order to reach somewhere, then we enter spaces like malls, cafes, offices, where again, it's completely cooled by the ACs, right? Someone is serving us water, or we have the liberty or the financial ability to buy drinks that will give us some, will alleviate the heat a little bit. But most of the people who work in a city, who migrate to the city to do that, do not have that kind of luxury. And that's exactly what's going to happen with these heat waves, right? It's nothing is, I think we are just going to be definitely the safer ones. But let's talk about the most of the people in India, right, who are barely trying to make ends meet. The higher heat levels caused by climate change, they are going to lead to a decline in working conditions. And of course, due to the heat, and since our bodies are not really evolved to handle this kind of heat, because it's the heat waves and the temperature rise is happening at such a rapid pace that our bodies have not really evolved to endure that kind of heat wave, right? It's not evolved to function in that kind of temperature condition. So a consistent rise in heat level will reduce the productivity of the workers if they're not able to find proper conditions to work in, and it will undermine their health, their well-beings. It will also put a stress on hospitals, on government when they have to dole out unemployment benefits, on agricultural systems, for example, right? So there is absolutely no, I would say, positive when it comes to heat waves. So, for example, the other day we were discussing AI. There are some positives to it, right? But an issue like climate change and heat wave, there are absolutely no positives to that, right? Thousands of people will be forced to migrate from where they live, from where they work. And of course, the governments and the international organizations will collectively have to deal with that problem. And we all know how successful, or let's say how bad it can get. So for me, it's really like a bad scenario and something that we are not prepared for. And the ILO published a report called Working on a Warmer Planet, and they put a number to this problem that I just talked about. So they said that India is expected to lose 5.8% of working hours by 2030 due to heat stress. And because we have a really large population, in absolute terms, we are expected to lose the equivalent of 34 million full-time jobs in 2030. Just imagine this on top of the unemployment problem that we are already facing, that we are not really talking about as much as we should. This is a huge issue, and that I believe is a fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think echoing your point, I think there's a joke on this podcast, and I'm ever the optimist. But unfortunately, with this, there is no silver lining at all. And it only is going to get worse with time. There's something that you said that ILO is talking about till 2030. I was reading a study from the University of Cambridge, and they talked about the fact that even after that, they take a longer term view. And in 2050, they're predicting about a 15% decrease in outdoor working capacity during the day due to extreme heat, which translates to up to 2.8 to 8.7% of our GDP between 2060 and 2100. Essentially, what that means is that they're also predicting that there will be reverse progress in inequality and poverty reduction. So essentially, we may stand to lose the little ground that we've gained when it comes to equity, when it comes to reducing poverty, which is big sustainable development goal that we all sign up for, right? So it's not only going to impact us in terms of, oh, things are going to get bad, but we stand to lose a lot of the progress that we've already made. And I think that's why it's also important to think about this in terms of jobs, because yes, there is a human impact to it. We talked about floods, and there is also a cost associated with floods. I was reading the NDMA data. The average annual flood damage in the last 10 years, and this is the most updated period that NDMA has, was 4745 crores or 4745 crores, as opposed to 1805 crores for the previous 53 years. That was the average for the previous 53 years versus the average in the last 10 years has gone up to 4,745 crores. So there is a huge cost also associated with climate disasters like heat waves and flood, which we will have to bear as an economy. Couple that with reverse growth, reverse progress on poverty, and then the fact that we don't have an ability to move past this and add more productive jobs. So it paints a really, really morbid picture. But let's dig a little bit deeper into this. And before we talk about how we can potentially solve this, who are the people that will be getting impacted? Sudisha, you spoke a little bit about how, given our socioeconomic privilege, we may be sheltered from the worst of it. The numbers tend to indicate this is going to impact 90% of India's population at some point or the other, but we're not going to be the first line of impact per se, in your own words, right? So let's maybe paint a picture of who are the people who are at most risk and what kind of jobs need urgent intervention today to actually help mitigate these conditions.
Yeah, so I think in any kind of climate emergency, whether it's a storm, cyclone, heat wave, the vulnerable workers are definitely the ones who suffer the most. But this differs from country to country. So, what happens in India, right? What are vulnerable working conditions in India, or who comes under vulnerable workers in India? So, according to the research that I have done, and what my understanding is, agriculture workers are definitely the most vulnerable when it comes to heat. Just imagine working the entire day, scorching heat on a farm. Plus, the heat is also reducing the crop output. So, the way I see it, it's a double whammy, right? Not only are your income reducing as a farmer, but at the same time, it's increasingly difficult for you to work on your farm because of the heat. So that's a problem which is twofold. Then we need to think about factory workers in India, especially those which require heat as one of the components in order to manufacture. So people who work near brick kilns, for example. And I actually watched like a journalist have investigated documentary which was not on India, it was on Pakistan. But I saw that a lot of these brick makers are actually illiterate, and because of that, when they have an emergency, they tend to borrow money from the owner of the brick factory. And because they're not able to understand the debt contract and how much they actually owe the person and what's the interest rate and all that, they continue to suffer because the brick maker generally ties them to that job for life. So not only are they the person who borrowed the money doing the job, their wife, their mother, their 10-year-old son, all of them have to work in the brick making factory just to make ends meet. And I'm sure that if it's happening in a country which is so close to ours, which has the same socio-economic landscape, I'm pretty sure it's happening in India as well, right? And we've read countless news reports on how establishment owners tend to abuse the workers through financial means and through, I don't know, psychologically or whatever, not providing them the right conditions to thrive or work in. And the funny bit is that the establishment owners end up hurting their own business's productivity, right? So it's happening at a rapid scale in India that heat waves are happening and the establishment owners know that their workers are getting affected by it, but they're not really doing anything about it. And so far, because the workers are so poor, they just have to do that job. But that doesn't mean that it's going to get easy as the time passes, right? It's going to become more difficult. So, for example, I was reading about this factory worker in Tamil Nadu who works in a fabric factory, and every single day he has to work without AC and not even a fan, as per what he said. So, all the workers in that factory, in the humid heat of Tamil Nadu, are working, and it's so difficult for them, right? I read his first person account, and he said that he often faints, or he feels dehydrated a lot of the time. And the owner doesn't understand that, because the owner is sitting inside in AC'd office, right? So he doesn't understand what his workers are going through, as long as his quota is met. And then, of course, we need to also think about people who migrate to big cities and do ordinary jobs like delivery, household chores, janitor jobs, vegetable vendors, etc. Because they're living in slums and can't afford electrical appliances that can alleviate heat, it's more difficult for them. And it's important to remember that cities are essentially heat islands, right? During the winters, when there is fog, cities tend to get lesser fog than rural areas surrounding them, because cities are heat islands. Cities just generate heat in general through electrical appliances, through factories, through automobiles, right? So it's more difficult for these people who are migrating to the city and doing jobs, because they have to go back and sleep in their one bedroom apartment along with their family, and don't even have a fan or a cooler or an AC. So just imagine how difficult it is for them. They do not even get a good night's sleep in order to work the next day, and they get have to. So I think in India, agriculture workers, factory workers, and people who do ordinary jobs like delivery and janitor jobs, etc., they're going to suffer the most. And I think they already have started to do that.
Yeah, it's a sobering picture, right? When you're describing it so visual, and it can feel almost, it feels sobering actually, and it feels scary, and it feels real, and it feels now and urgent. And to your point, I think there's reports that have been done talking about bonded labor in factories, including brick kilns in India. There was a report out of Odisha that The Wire had done a few years ago, and work that is being done in this space. And financial inclusion definitely seems like one of those interventions that can help. But this entire conversation can feel a little bit like, hey, everything's out of control. I was reading about this concept of climate-induced depression or anxiety as well. Like, people are starting to feel anxious due to this huge, big picture of climate change and the impact that it's going to cause in our lives. In fact, I was watching an interview by Greta Thunberg, and she spoke about how working on this issue for a sustained and prolonged period of time made her really scared and made her really anxious as well. But then we also have to remember that there is still a locus of control. And even if we don't have full control, there are things that we should be doing to make things better. So after we come back from our break, let's talk about, as policy enthusiasts, as people who study public policy and work in this area, what can we do today and what can we do now to actually help make the situation a little bit better in terms of the people who are going to suffer the most when it comes to job losses due to heat. And we're back. Okay. Sudisha, we were just talking about the real human impact of heat and climate and the impact that it's going to have on jobs. You spoke to us about how the impact has already started, especially for those on the margins, given India employs a lot of its labor today in fields like agriculture, which are heat exposed already. There is need for urgent intervention. We spoke a little bit and touched a little bit about how financial inclusion could play an important role in the policy changes that one could make today. But do you want to walk us through what is it that we can do to solve this problem? And solving may be a bit of a stretch. It definitely does feel like it's a larger problem. But what can we do to make things better?
Yeah, so let me clarify that there's not much the government can do, of course, because climate change is happening on a global scale. But there are some things, sure, that they can do. And I did look at the advisory booklet that the government released in order to counter heat waves in India. And I'll be honest, it didn't highlight or outline a very strategic plan at all. I think the intention was great, and the direction that they were trying to take was also excellent, but I failed to see a well-defined strategy. The burden was on citizens to be cautious and mindful of heat conditions before stepping out, but it was mostly from a health perspective. What I was looking for was a guideline from an economic perspective on how the government plans on making sure that the workers don't suffer due to the heat waves and how we can retain our economic productivity. But then I also looked at some of the public discourse on how we can ensure that the government is tackling heat stress in India. And I actually found this wonderful article published by the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And they did highlight a few things that we can do, I mean, the government can do in order to ensure that heat waves don't affect us as much as they are right now and that they will continue to. So one of the first thing that they recommended was vulnerability mapping, and which is very similar to the strategy that the government adopted during COVID-19 when they implemented real-time monitoring by assigning hotspot designation to certain places which were the likeliest to have COVID, where let's say 100 people had COVID or whatever, that was assigned as a hotspot and special care and security was given to that place. So I think with respect to heat, the same thing can happen. So if you take Delhi, for example, central Delhi, where there are a lot of trees and there's a Safdarjung area, is not a hotspot because it has a good enough green cover. So the trees are definitely going to reduce the overall temperature there, that the surface temperature is going to be lower. But when you look at places like Uttam Nagar, which is, like urban hell is what I would like to call such places, right? Devoid of any trees, any nature, just houses stack up one after another. Those are definitely hotspots. And big construction sites. I think there's an IKEA being constructed near my apartment in Gurgaon because it's a really big project. And on Google Map, it shows IKEA. And I just thought that there's so many people working there, construction workers. And I'm supposing that IKEA at least offers them the right gear to work with, which at least helps them in countering the heat of it. But when you look at local construction projects, that kind of care is not being taken for the workers as long as the productivity quota is met, right? So hotspot monitoring, much like COVID-19, is very important when it comes to heat wave monitoring. And that can be actually achieved if the government decides to partner with organizations that offer geospatial technology along with field-based assessments. So using technology like fine resolution satellite data or the population distribution and maybe land surface temperatures, satellites constantly monitoring these factors can actually be really important in understanding the heat sensitivity of a region. So the government knows where to direct more of their funds and resources instead of using it as like a one-size-fits-all approach, which is not going to work in India because we have so many different kinds of landscapes, right? So we need to develop a strategy which is real-time, which is agile, which can be molded, and it should be dynamic based on the different regions in India and the heat sensitivity of those regions. The second one would be effective IEC, which is information, education, and communication. So I actually just received a message from, I think, the meteorological department that there's going to be rain and storm in Gurgaon in the next 3 hours. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for heat wave also. Now the question is, how does this information reach the most vulnerable people that we highlighted? How is that? Of course, I can read a message on my phone and know that there's a heat wave condition. I shouldn't go out. But what about the most vulnerable people? So maybe setting up some legal standards on how employers deal with heat. So, for example, construction gets banned when there is high winter pollution in Delhi, right? Something similar like that. Something like when it rains so much that the government issues an advisory on maybe the schools can be closed or maybe offices can issue work from home. So we need to start treating heat as a severe weather event, which traditionally we have not, because India has always been a hot country. So we need to start thinking of heat as a severe weather events, and only then we can move towards a direction where we are building legal standards which accommodate the issues faced by vulnerable workers. And then maybe, stuff like construction or manufacturing or production can be maybe capped, or maybe, I don't want to say banned, but maybe delayed for a bit. Like maybe if there's a heat wave for a week, the number of hours should be capped. Of course, implementation is a problem, right? We can build as many laws as possible, but the implementation is a challenge in India. But of course, if we move towards that direction, the right people will get that information. Because I remember that when the construction got banned during winter events, all the people who were working at the back of my home, there was a house being constructed, they all went to their villages for a month or so. So, people get the right information which affects their lives. And if we develop a system where there should be a productivity or working hour cap, when you treat heat as a severe weather event, the right people will get that information. So effective and innovative information is very important. Then there was this another excellent tip, which was that states and their disaster management and weather department needs to work together to build strategies which can alleviate the impact of heat waves. So, for example, disaster management authorities should work alongside the weather departments so that the weather departments know exactly, because they can predict if there's going to be a heat wave. The disaster management authorities should already be completely ready, right? If anything bad is going to happen, we are gonna be there. We're gonna have the means to fix that problem if something goes bad. So there needs to be a lot of cooperation between these departments. And of course, something that I highlighted earlier, that we need to let go of the one size fits all approach. We need to set up independent regional heat indicators. We can't compare Kashmir to Thar Desert, right? It's a completely different geographic landscape. So we need a different index for such places. We need a different indicator for such places. We need to let go of a one size fits all approach. And of course, it requires hard work, but we need to start doing that. So, for example, the Odisha State Disaster Management Authority collaborated with IMD to define region-specific thresholds that combine humidity and temperature, which is more representative of human heat stress rather than just absolute air temperature. And it's so important for a state like Odisha, right? Because of the cyclones and the heat waves that they face, they are always constantly facing extreme events with respect to weather. So, very important regional and state-wise heat sensitivity assessment is required. And this will only happen when the central government decentralizes the process of heat assessment. And this is not related to any party, right? This is something that is our future. No matter which party comes to power, we need decentralized heat management in India, because every state is different. Every geographical landscape in those states is different. And sometimes within a state, the landscape can vary so much, right? You have a place full of lakes and a desert in the same state. It doesn't make sense, right? So we need those region specific indicators at the same time. And I just want to end this with the story of Ahmedabad, because in 2010 they had a lethal heat wave, and temperature surpassed 48 degrees Celsius and around 800 people died. And this happened in 1 month due to the heat. So Ahmedabad adopted a very strict strategy in order to deal with the heat waves. And since 2010, their efforts have really helped prevent heat wave related, or maybe reduce heat wave related deaths in the city. So the first thing that they implemented was a cool roofs program. So what's happened since the Britishers came to India and since we became more westernized, right, because of globalization and the opening up of the economy, that we are moving towards a very Western or Scandinavian architecture, which is not really suited for India. So just because it doesn't look pretty doesn't mean it's not effective, right? That's the thing I would like to say about Indian architecture. Just because you have, thatched roofs on mud houses doesn't mean it's not effective. That's actually way more effective than building concrete houses in a place where you get 45-degree temperatures, right? So that's exactly the principle that Ahmedabad followed. And they introduced a cool roofs program. So they identified slums, or they worked with women association in the city in order to identify houses and maybe whole slums where the roof of the house was made by tin sheets or asbestos, and they either financially helped or partnered with organizations that could install cool roofing materials like tiles or solar reflective paints. A lot of times they would paint the roof of the house white, and this really helped some of those people in living in those houses, especially women who tend to be at home caring for the children and taking care of household chores when they are working at home. And Telangana actually copy pasted the entire same concept because of how successful this was. And another interesting thing that they did was personal outreach. They used media outlets, they made orientation materials, they made pamphlets, advertisements on heat stress prevention. They used text messages, email, radio, social media such as WhatsApp, etc. And special efforts were made to reach vulnerable population through, maybe, I don't know, a lot of times I've seen after talking to some of the people who live in rural India that they generally have one educated person in their village or colony who gives them all the important information, right? So having contact with that person is very important, and
Like an older
giving them
person.
the right news. Yeah. A lot of the times the sarpanch or someone assigns person who knows a certain level of English or knows a certain or has certain level of literacy. So identifying that person from village to village, from area to area is very important, so that they get these vulnerable population get the information that elite people are getting, right? And of course, it's very important. Something else, just a lesson from the Ahmedabad model, is that the capacity building among healthcare professionals needs to be increased. So we are looking at maybe increased hospital beds, similar to COVID-19, right? Increased hospital beds, increased oxygen tanks, maybe since it's heat, maybe increased electrolytes availability or something like that, right? Just pouring your funds in that direction is very important. Intentional efforts to counter heat is very important. And this will only happen when the entire country starts taking heat or starts considering heat as a severe weather event, just like Ahmedabad did. And thankfully, a lot of the other cities and states are inspired by that model, which shows that we can actually implement a model like that if we are determined to do that. So, I'm seeing, for example, just end with this actually, I'm seeing that a lot of construction projects in India are being okayed, and they are being okayed because the authorities say that the trees that we are cutting, we're just going to replant them. And that replantation is also happening at a certain level, but replantation is not successful, not as successful as you want it to be. Right? A lot of replanted trees die out really soon. They're not able to get accustomed to the environment that they're replanted in. And this is also something that we need to consider. We need to start okaying projects just for the sake of economic productivity that are just going to result in a decrease in that economic productivity in the future, right? We need to stop focusing on instant gratification and focus on long-term development, sustainable development when we are okaying projects. And Singapore is doing that, right? So can we. So I think these things can go a long way. The government. So I was reading this excellent piece by an urban practitioner who said that a lot of the trees in Delhi are not suitable for here. They've been transported from some other city, some other
Because they
country,
look
some other
pretty.
state. Yeah, they look pretty, for example, or they can just maybe, I don't know, they maybe were brought here and they were easily able to get adapted to our soil or whatever, but that doesn't mean that they're right for our environment. So we need to identify what trees are suitable for a particular environment, and we need to have focused efforts on planting those trees instead of all this replantation stuff that keeps happening. And it is a thing, right? Especially in the coastal areas in the country, there is rampant coastal zone violation, and a lot of the projects are being okayed at the expense of mangroves being cut. And that's really horrendous for me. I mean, I don't see a positive scenario where you cut hundreds of trees in order to set up a building. And maybe it will lead to economic productivity at some point, but eventually you're gonna need, I don't know, some kind of system which deals with the heat wave in that place where that building is constructed. And if you don't have nature supporting you, there's only so much you can control. So we need to start building our cities and our buildings alongside the nature. We need to develop a kind of, I would say, camaraderie with the nature. We need to be mindful of what we are doing in order to accomplish something and whether it's worth it or not. And I think that's how I want to end this answer.
Yeah, I think you've given us a lot to think about, especially the last point that you said about how we need to be in harmony with nature. When you were talking about mangroves being cut down, I come from Bengal, and the Sundarbans are not just the crowning glory, but also a source of livelihood. That's what people in Bengal do in that area. Is they fish in the mangroves as well, because the Sundarbans kind of act as a nursery for fish, and they help the fish multiply. And if they actually reduce the mangroves or they cut it down, there will be less production of fish, not just in Bengal, but along the entire Bay of Bengal coastline, which includes Bengal, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, all of it. So the ramifications are so big, even on everything comes back to livelihood in one manner or the other, right? And I think you put it beautifully, is there is a need for a just transition to more sustainable, ecologically sustainable and economically sustainable modes of production and more sustainable economies as well. So my takeaways from all of this has been, we need to start looking at heat as not an emerging weather event, but a current, urgent, severe weather event, right? Develop a localized approach, make sure people have the information that they need via a combination of technology and assisted workflows as well, which could include your local sarpanch or your local, community organizer, making sure the most marginalized get the information. And then going back to indigenous practices in terms of making sure that we're dealing with it in a sustainable fashion, whether it's updating, to your point, the cool roofs program, right? Going back to thatched roofs in rural areas or even cities, or it's simply about making sure that we're not greenlighting short-term projects, but really looking at a long-term overview. Usually climate change, and I think you said this as well, the government can't do a lot when it comes to heat loss specifically, because there is a larger mandate to deal with the climate disaster that is imminent. I know countries, including ours, have signed up for lofty goals, but I think there is a need to parallel process all of this. Yes, we want to battle the larger climate change as well, but we need to start acting on all of these parameters today and not just make the problem so big that it seems like we can't solve it. So on that very optimistic note, Sudisha, that you've left us on, I hope that folks enjoyed our podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.